So this is the latest PSSDiag Configuration Manager. This is the tool that you'll use to create PSSDiag packages, which will gather data from your instances of SQL Server. First couple things to note. On the left, you'll choose whether you are working on an x86, Itanium, or x64 instance. I'm going to be configuring this for x64. Itanium is only valid for SQL Server 2008 R2 and below, so be aware of that. Along the top, we have the versions of SQL Server, and you'll want to pick the right version. I'm going to gather data off of a SQL Server 2012 instance. One point that's really important is to get the machine name and instance name information correct. If you're gathering data locally off of a SQL server that is not clustered, you can actually just take the default value, which is hard to see here, but it's actually a period, and that's just the local reference. So if you leave it at that, it will try to gather data off the local system. You can use this to gather data locally, but it is not recommended for performance reasons and because this will put a lot of data on your network. If you're gathering data from a clustered instance of SQL, under the machine name, you will want to put the virtual server name. Under instance name, it's also hard to see, but the default is an asterisk. So that will gather data from all SQL instances it finds on that server. You're not typically going to want that, so it is a much better idea to put in the specific instance name for the instance that you want to gather data from. You'll need to set up your connection. We'll typically gather the event logs on shutdown. This is a lot of good information, so typically you will want to leave that enabled. Perfmon is fairly all-inclusive. We gather a lot of data with Perfmon, including all the SQL counters, processor information, memory information, physical and logical disk information, network information. So this is pretty all-inclusive. I tend not to have to add anything to this. If I'm dealing with a specific kind of memory issue, I may also include the paging file, but that is about the only thing I typically will add, and I add that rather rarely, to be honest. The SQL Diag option up here at the top right will gather, will run SQL Diag essentially. It'll gather error logs and do a number of other scripts when SQL Server shuts down by default, or you can do that on startup. Underneath that, you'll also have the configuration options for our trace. We will gather a PSSDiag trace by default, and there are a couple of templates available. So general performance is what I will use the vast majority of the time. There is also a detailed performance. I tend not to use detailed because of the amount of data that this will capture and the greater possibility of this to affect performance on the system in question. I will do a separate video where we will talk more about performance implications because that is a common and a reasonable concern. But when you capture detailed performance, it will gather statement level events and execution plans. So that's the big dividing point between the two. Generally, I will get general performance, which does not capture execution plans or statement level events. If I need to get that information, I can always run a detailed trace later or get it through other methods. Under custom diagnostics, we have a number of things already checked by default, and there are a number of other things that may occasionally be helpful. If you are having problems with database mirroring or full text search or linked server configuration, we have specific things to gather that information. We also have a gatherer for getting more information on SQL memory errors, and the SQL blocking group will actually turn on trace flags so that we can capture information about deadlocking in the error logs if you're not already doing so. We capture information about blocking in one of the files from PSSDiag by default, but we won't see information about deadlocks unless you have the trace flags enabled. The one option I use here most often now is I use delete old trace files, and what this allows you to do is to specify a specific number of trace files and perfmon BLG files that you will keep in the output folder. This helps prevent you from running out of disk space, essentially because you're gathering such a large amount of data. The profiler trace files and the perfmon BLG's files will be the largest files in the capture, and I will frequently enable this option to make sure that when I'm capturing data, I won't gather more than I want to have. The default option is to gather 12 trace files and 12 BLG files, which for the trace file data, 12 of the trace files I think would be about 3 gigabytes of data. So I'm going to choose this option and we'll go ahead and save at this point so you can see what that interface looks like. Now I am going to set this to c:/PSSDiag. That's where I'm going to save my file. Oh, actually, let me backtrack one moment. I'm going to change the instance name to actually be the instance we will gather data from in a moment. So I'm gathering data from my SQL 2012 instance. Now I'm going to save this to c:/PSSDiag PSSD.cab. Now when I hit OK, it'll create the cab file, but it'll first ask me, since I wanted to specify the number of trace files, it's going to ask me what that number is. I'm going to set it to 24 for this capture, and I'm going to hit OK, and that will create my package for me. So now we have PSSDiag configured. We'll use this to gather some data and run through how that works in the next video. Thank you.